Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I have a very special guest. His name is Josh Rasmussen, probably one of my favorite philosophers, especially in philosophy of religion as well as philosophy of mind. So I guess before we get started, what's your background and like what do you study? Now I left all your information in the description, but if you kind of tell in person what you kind of do.
So I am a philosopher, and my focus is primarily, I would say, in analytic metaphysics, sort of the foundation of things or the nature of things. And then I will see applications in metaphysics to kind of the big questions people ask about the nature of minds. The existence of God comes up, obviously. And so I think a lot of people kind of know me for my work in the philosophy of religion, but my work in the philosophy of religion really does grow out of this kind of more primary interest in like the basic nature of things. So that's kind of what I'm about.
Okay. And then I'm assuming you also do philosophy of mind as well. So we'll start with that. So my first question to you would be, what is the best approach for discerning philosophy of mind? So like, what's a good starting point to kind of explore that field?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about a kind of basic methodology for exploring any field, and that is to start with what's the clearest to you. And I think this is kind of a good way of approaching, because I think sometimes people will get sort of lost in the weeds of controversy and they don't know of how to get their bearings. And so in the philosophy of mind, I like to start with, okay, what's the clearest? So I'll start with my experiences, my feeling of contentment, or my thoughts. I'll bring a thought before my mind, and then I'll begin to ponder that thought. And we'll get into these things. I brought these things here to help us to think about some of the clear things. And these things represent items of existence. And just to kind of illustrate one thing, and we'll get more into this as we continue. If I have this object here and I focus on like one of its properties, let's say it's greenness, okay? And then I consider my feeling of curiosity. And then I ask myself, is my feeling of curiosity the same or different than the greenness of this object here? Well, I think that I have this power to see difference in the same way that I can see that true is different from false. I can actually see by my direct awareness of the green quality and the experience of curiosity, and I can compare them and see that they're different. Now, on one level, that might seem sort of basic. Like, what can who would disagree with that? What can you derive from that? But what I've discovered is that when you start with the things that are the most clear, you can actually find yourself along a path that all of a sudden leads you to places that other people are debating. And rather than enter into those debates with sophisticated arguments, I want to go back and retrace my steps to the clearest things. And I think as we discuss, we'll see some of the things that I think can be clear. Some things are less clear. Obviously different people see different things. But that would be my basic methodology. Start with what's clearest. And then in the philosophy of mind, I would start with the phenomenon of consciousness, the stuff that's internal to your own experience.
Right. And I find it fascinating because like another big question is like, why is there something rather than nothing? But I think this question in relation to the mind-body problem, I think is also, I would say maybe even more important, right? Because in order to actually understand why there is something, we have to understand how does our minds relate to that something, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that in some way you could say that this question with regards to the mind-body problem is probably even more important in some way than the question of why there's something rather than nothing. Because in order to understand what something is, you first have to start off with your own mind.
Right? Yeah, you can't know anything without knowledge, without a mind that can know. Right. And then questions about our minds are very relevant to us, right? I mean, because we have minds and everything we ever experience is experienced in our minds, right? Like the most significant things about life take place in a mind, right? I mean, you might imagine something significant is outside of your mind, but it's only significant to you once it has some effect on your mind. So yeah, I definitely think this is a very central an important question to think about.
So there's a lot of views on this position. So let's kind of go over just the basics. So You got physicalism, which, and again, there's various forms of that, but basically physicalism says that all is physical, right? That our minds are kind of just byproducts of something that's outside our mind. Maybe not outside our mind, but outside the contents of our experience. So basically you would say that what we experience as a physical world somehow our experiences come from that, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's a lot of issues with that proposal. We'll get into that later. Then the second proposal I would say is dualism, where you have two fundamental different things, right? So you have the mind, but you can't reduce it. But you also have something called the physical, something that's outside the mind per se, but that's also irreducible. And then you have a third option, which is idealism, and that is where basically all is mental in some sense. And so I guess my next question is, what do you think about because when you really compare idealism to physicalism, just taking these two options, right? You have the physicalist, which says that all is physical, right? But then you have the idealist, which says all is mental. Well, they're mirror in some way. They're kind of like mirrors to each other, meaning they have a lot of similarities because they can both accept like casual closure, for example. So they can like both accept that there's only one thing in nature, right? But they disagree about what that nature is, right? So the idealist would say that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality. And then the physicalist would say that there's something beyond consciousness, and then that is the fundamental nature of reality. So do you think that idealism is a kind of a good counter ontology? Or in other words, you can kind of use a lot of the arguments for physicalism and then, make them into some sort of like idealism per se. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like how you said it. It's sort of a mirror. I mean, I've had this experience that, that young woman, old woman picture. It's like you look at the picture, it's one picture, and you look at it, it looks like a young woman. And then your mind sort of like changes its interpretation. All of a sudden it looks like an old woman. And I've had this kind of gestalt shift thinking about this sort of mind first, matter first ontologies, because there's a way in which you can like explain everything in terms of mind, or you can explain everything in terms of material stuff.
Right.
And it's sort of like a mirror image, I've also had this analogy of like flying an airplane where you could flip the airplane upside down. And I've heard that sometimes pilots would get confused and their airplanes would go upside down, and they would think that they needed to pull up, but they would actually be pulling down into the ground. And so in a way you could say that, well, maybe the material first is the right side up view and the mind first is upside down, or maybe it's the other way. Maybe the mind first is the right side up view. And it's so fascinating, Kyle, how it seems like you can sort of explain everything in terms of the ontology of that view. And so you almost have to like get into the other view to like appreciate that. Because if you're just stuck in one side, then it's almost like the other side seems like crazy talk. But then just like if somebody says, oh, that looks like an old woman. Oh, that's a young woman. It's like, well, you almost have to see it all the way out. And I've had this experience just like looking out the window and like thinking, okay, what am I seeing? It's like, well, it's material stuff, but then I'll have a dream. I've literally had dreams where it's like the same category of stuff. And I'm like, and I know I'm dreaming, right? I've had this dream multiple times where one time in particular, I remember like seeing the mountains and the sky, and I'm dreaming, and I know I'm dreaming, and I'm thinking, okay, I know that there's not actually sky there. There's not like physical sky there. But what is that? Because I can distinguish the sky part of my dream from the mountain part of my dream. So it seems like I'm aware of something, because if we're all just nothing, then it would just be one nothing compared with another nothing. And that's just all just nothing. You couldn't make distinctions. So like I'm aware of something, and then it's like, oh, it's kind of the same sort of thing. And I almost like have this gestalt shift of thinking,
it's interesting.
Is the material world states of mind just like in the dream? Yeah.
No, yeah, because I mean, we can talk about question 5 was actually about dream characters, so we'll get to that in a moment. But that is interesting how, so basically under both views, you could pretty much explain at least our experience of reality under those sort of views. So I guess the only question to ask really at that point, because I feel like the disagreements between physicalists and idealists are not about causal closure. Should they both accept that there is one reality and that everything interacts? The question then is, what is the nature of consciousness itself? right?
Yeah.
Is consciousness something that is irreducible? Because if it is, well, obviously the physicalists, that's not going to really work with their position, right? So with that in mind, before we kind of get, because I have a question about irreducibility, but a third question I want to ask is about dualism. And so the first question, and then we'll get to the second question once you answer it. But so I was thinking of dualism and how there's like two different fundamental substances. And I guess you can just briefly answer, but do you think that a dualism that has two fundamental different substances has an interaction problem, like some sort of like, because there are two different things fundamentally, then there's going to be some sort of interaction problem going on?
Yeah. Well, there can certainly be a question about how they can interact. I've wondered, sometimes people say, how can they interact? And there's a difference between seeing that it can't happen and just not seeing how it could happen. And I think that, if somebody sees or senses like, well, this is just impossible, you can't have two different categories of substance interacting, then that would pose a problem for that person. I don't know. I've not really had that kind of an intuition so much. Fields interact with charged particles. They're very different in their nature, the field and the particle. I don't know, like how different in nature do you have to be before you can't interact? I think it's going to depend on the case, really. So,
no, right.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's not, well, here's the thing with my issues with dualism don't really have to do with the interaction problem per se. I think it just has to do with simplicity, right? Because if I only have to posit one thing, then I don't need to posit something else. Which brings me to my next question, which is, do you think that there are any good arguments for the irreducibility of the physical? So instead of talking about the irreducibility of consciousness, you're talking about the irreducibility of something beyond consciousness. What do you think about that?
So a difficult part of this question is defining physical. This is one of my first questions in graduate school. And I actually remember asking one of my professors, and this was a professor who could like answer every question I ever asked him. And then I asked him, well, what do you mean by physical? And I was fully expecting the answer to come. And he was like, Josh, that's a really good question. I don't know. And then I took a course with Alvin Plantinga, and we spent about a month just on this question. What is it? What does the term physical really mean? And so because it's difficult to define that term, I like to see if I can think about these things as much as I can without using that term.
Right.
And so I think it can help to illustrate the idea of reduction is just, I'm using this as an example.
Yeah.
So you might think of like, there's a shape of this, there's a color of this. Okay. We could talk about functions, which are ordered sets that have inputs and outputs. And what are the inputs? Well, maybe there's a certain shape input and then a shape output. And I like to break things down to the basic concepts. So let me just like focus on shape and color here. And I want to illustrate a kind of argument that I think applies more generally when we think about reducing consciousness to material aspects of the brain or patterns of particles in the brain. So I put in my notes here 3 different types of arguments. There's more than 3. But
if you want to share screen, you can. I'll share it if you want.
My notes are too messy.
Oh,
at this point.
okay.
I will. One of the arguments I think we can share. This is the counting argument.
Okay.
But one argument is based on a basic power I think that we have to see differences. So I mentioned this. So if we look at the green here, and one thing we could wonder is this piece. This is one of my kids' toys. These magnet shapes. They love to play with this. And one question is like, is this piece actually feeling curious right now? I mean, we could speculate about that. Like, how would we know, right? You might think, well, it's not telling us. It's not acting like it's curious. Well, how would we know? It doesn't have a mouth to share.
Yeah, because my perspective on like physical objects is I take more of a bundle theorist approach. So basically, all physical objects are just properties, right? So
collections of properties,
collections of properties. So basically, there is no, under my position, there is no intrinsic substance to a physical thing. Like it's just a bunch of properties put together, and that's about it, right? And so we can describe our experience of the physical world in terms of just these properties, right? So when we talk about the shape or size or color of an object, it's literally just experiences. It literally just that sort of thing. Like the color green, for example, right? that's under my position, that doesn't really exist out there, so to speak. It's just kind of in our perception of it.
Yeah,
right?
and this is a nice distinction, because for this argument that I want to make, I'm not even assuming that there's a substance that has these properties.
Right.
Maybe these just are a bundle of properties, right? And the only thing I want to point out here is that I think you have the power to see that the green of this object, if it's now if you're worried that the green isn't external, like maybe the green is internal, that's fine. Just wherever the green is, you can compare that green to other properties. And I think you can compare the green to the shape, and that's how one way you can verify that green is not the same thing as square. You can just directly see that. And so I actually think you do have the power to directly see that feeling sad or feeling happy, that those properties, the property of experiencing something, is not the same as a color or a shape or even a function. One of the early versions of the reductionist view is a kind of behaviorist view. And the behaviorism is kind of a proto-functionalist view, where you basically say that let's say the experience of being in pain just is the state of being such that you would shout ouch if poked. Or, that you're grimacing, like that's, but what happens if you're not grimacing, but you are feeling in pain?
It doesn't make,
there are challenges, and there are responses to those challenges. But I think that actually those arguments can make things more complex than they need to be. I think you have a basic power to see differences, and you can just use this power. So that's one argument against reduction. I would say maybe the most powerful argument, which isn't the most, maybe the most dialectically persuasive. So I want to share the most powerful argument, and then the one that seems like it has kind of more.
This would be my fourth question, which would be, what do you think is the best argument for the irreducibility of the mental? So we can see.
Yeah, thank you.
What it is.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of related to this power to see differences, except focus on different properties of the thing. So I think, for example, I can be aware of thinking without being aware of this piece here. Okay, what that would suggest to me is that thinking has a property that this thing here doesn't have, namely being an object of my awareness. So that's a reason to think they're different. And in the same way, I think that I can be aware of my thinking without being aware of chunks of matter in my brain or particles. Okay, and to be honest, Kyle, I'm certain of this. I'm certain that I can be aware, and I'm not aware of that. And this thoroughly convinces me. And there's various types of responses we could go through, but this thoroughly convinces. Like, I'm more certain that that I've got mental features like thinking and feeling that aren't the same as material features of my brain than I am that other people exist. Because when it comes to the existence of other people, my reason for thinking other people exist, it's based on probabilistic inference. I could be hallucinating. I think it's probable that other people exist.
Because I mean, like Sam Harris says, I mean, consciousness cannot be an illusion. Like, that's the one thing that cannot be an illusion. Doesn't matter how much you throw in there. It doesn't matter even if we're in the Matrix, right? Like, even if this whole world is an illusion, you still have thoughts, right? You still have that sort of conscious experience of your own thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, to think that you have no thoughts feels self-defeating. Now, I want to emphasize, when I say that this convinces me, I wasn't always convinced by this. I remember in college, somebody suggested to me that consciousness is not just a matter of matter, a complexity of matter. And I was skeptical of them. And I replied saying, well, maybe you just need the right kind of complexity of matter, and that will be what consciousness is. Not what makes consciousness, not what explains it. That's a separate question, but what consciousness is. But when I began to take courses in the philosophy of mind, and some of these distinctions, like the difference between explaining consciousness and being consciousness, were clearer to me, then I switched. And so I want to really emphasize, I think it's possible to be sure that you're conscious, even though it's also possible for people to rationally eliminate. There are eliminativists who eliminate consciousness, and they've got some interesting arguments. if you actually read the literature on that, I mean, it's sort of interesting to work through their arguments, as well as reductionists who would reduce consciousness to the material. But I take John Searle's view on this. I mean, he thinks that reducing consciousness to just particles in motion, or matter in motion, or functions of matter, is really just another way of eliminating it.
Yeah.
It's like saying the heads of a coin really is the tails. It's like, okay, well, heads and tails are correlated. If you spin a coin, then the heads and the tails spin together. But that doesn't mean the heads is the tails.
No, right.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, you do. I think you brought up a good point with, like, we can know our own conscious thoughts, but we don't actually know about the actual brain processes, like the neurons that are going off, right? Like, no matter how much you introspect, you're never going to find, like, a neuron going off in your introspection, right? Like, you can introspect that you have neurons going off, but that's not the same thing as the actual neurons
and
going
it's
off.
important to make clear here that the structure of the argument is that if A is B, they're one and the same thing. So if this finger is this finger, then whatever is true of A is true of B. And so that's the structure of the argument. So if it's true that right now you are aware of a thought, okay, and that thought just is a particular C fiber firing, then it's true that you are aware of that particular C fiber firing.
And that
directly aware of it, like
Right.
immediately directly aware of it. And so if you think you're not immediately directly aware of a C fiber firing, then but that you are directly aware of a thought or a feeling, then there's something true of your thought that's not true of the C fiber firing. And so they can't be the same thing. And it's really worth spelling out the structure of the argument, because I see people hear the argument and then translate it into an argument that it isn't.
Like, they'll say that water is H2O or something like that, you know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, they'll use examples where the item is external, so you have indirect awareness of it. So it's not the same. It doesn't have the same structure there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess kind of like a side question. Why do you? So, like, I guess this is relevant, I would say. So some people would say that we just haven't figured it out yet. Like, we haven't figured out how to reduce consciousness to the brain. Then we should just assume that it does or we should just say we don't know that consciousness is irreducible. That somehow neuroscience in the future is going to figure out that some thought process or some thought that you have is just identical or reducible or emergent from a certain brain process. What do you think about that? Because
so there's a big difference between reduction and emergence. And when it comes to emergence, now we're not just saying the one is the other. We're saying the one comes from the other. And I mean, I think that is a very reasonable consideration. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we wouldn't really predict come forward. And so we need to sort of test. And maybe what we'll find here is that in order to get consciousness, you just put together materials in the right way. Like, maybe there is a way that I could organize these things. And if they function in the right way, then they would be conscious. In fact, you might even argue for this empirically. It looks like our brains are correlated with consciousness. And so this is evidence that the consciousness emerges from our brains. And if somebody is going to say, well, no, consciousness can't emerge from brains. Yeah, I mean, I think they've got to do some work to make the case for that. I mean, why can't it? Why is that impossible? I'm not saying there isn't more to be said here, but I mean, I want to really validate this kind of consideration. What would you say at this point?
Well, I would say that there's a distinction between weak emergence and then strong emergence. So weak emergence, for me, I wouldn't really see an issue with that, because I would say that's just reductionism in some other way. The issue I have is with strong emergence, where you get something like something completely different than the actual thing that produced it, right? And I don't think that's probable at all. I think that it doesn't really explain why consciousness could be strongly emergent from the brain or something like that. So
how do you think this might relate to the causal problem that you mentioned? So earlier you asked me if there's a kind of causal problem of the mind, the material, if they were two different substances. if there's a problem of them interacting. And my thought was it's not sort of obvious that there's a problem there. And if there's not a problem there, then I wonder, well, what is the problem of the matter just producing a mind?
I think so for me, I just don't think that you can get first person properties like thoughts, emotions from third person properties, because again, everything, even David Chalmers, he wrote a paper on this, and he basically says that the only thing that we could consider strongly emergent is consciousness. Like, we don't have any other examples of that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think overall, when you look at the big picture, I think the idealist view, I think, is simpler, because it's not positing something outside consciousness that, creates it or, emerges from it, but rather that consciousness is really all that exists, right?
Yeah.
So
and I'm not suggesting that there aren't things to be said here. In fact, I actually put in my notes, there's maybe 3 problems for the dependence view. There's a kind of construction problem or wrong materials problem, which I could say a little more about that. There's also this kind of binding problem of how you get individual things, even if they're conscious, like how do they bind together into a single conscious self? And then there's what you just hinted at here at the end, is a kind of prediction problem. So even if it's possible in principle to build these things, we still want the best explanation. There's sort of the simplest explanation that predicts the phenomenon. And so, if you have a foundational mind that will give you resources, it will predict things that you're not going to predict on a purely mindless.
Right. And notice how thoughts actually work. So thoughts aren't actually physical. Like, they don't have size, weight. Like, it makes no sense to describe like your beliefs as like on top of one another or something like that. And this is something that's called the location problem. And I think that would show that this whole idea that you can get something that has, shape, size, and mass to produce something that doesn't have, shape, size, and mass, which are thoughts. I think there's a big gap there, right?
Yeah, there is that challenge. And if I could just say one more thing about what you just said here, it's related to the materials problem or the construction problem. I find it just like helpful to use that methodology of like start with the clearest and see what you can build from there. So I could ask like, okay, maybe yellow isn't the same as being sad, but does yellow make sadness? So as long as you paint something yellow, the thing you just painted is thereby sad. It makes sadness. And I have the intuition that's impossible. Okay.
Right.
So like, I don't really have any. So some causal interactions, maybe they're different categories. I can't just see that they couldn't causally interact just by being in different categories. But some things just don't seem like they are possible. Like, I don't think I can add up numbers to produce a person. I don't think I can just make this a certain color, change its shape. And then if I take a bunch of these, well, does that make a difference? It seems like that's an irrelevant difference, just adding more of the objects together. Like, maybe for all we know, this is sad. This whole thing is sad, but it just doesn't seem to me when I think about it that it is.
And like another thing is like when you look at a brain just from like a purely third person perspective, if we couldn't infer that others were conscious, there's no way that you can tell from just brain processes that something is conscious, right? I think that's the other thing is like when you add in a bunch of third person properties, it doesn't matter how much you add in, you're never going to be able to produce anything more than more third person properties. So
there's something intuitive about that to me. Yeah. Just changing the pattern, making it shape different doesn't seem like, some people might think, well, maybe it's about functionality. You get the right functionality, but we can make things function as if they're laughing, right? And the function doesn't seem to be sufficient for the feeling.
And that's something that I think David Chalmers made a good point on in his book. I have it right here. I have 2 of his books actually, so I read both of these because he's probably one of my favorite philosophers of mind. But he makes the same point that basically it's not a matter of functions, right? So that's not the question. The question is, how are these functions accompanied by experience? And that's the question that you just can't answer from a materialist perspective. So
or if you could, there's still the problem of prediction. The mindless matter doesn't predict mentality. And so if you have a different hypothesis that does make that prediction, and its prior probability isn't inferior, its intrinsic probability is not so bad, then it could be a better explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
So now the next question I want to ask you, and this goes back to the dream character, the dream you were talking about earlier, about how dreams are basically like sometimes they're indistinguishable from reality, especially if you're not aware that you're dreaming. You basically have this experience, right, of a physical world that's not really physical in any sense.
Right.
Now I want to get your thoughts on this because there have been actual studies done on this which show that dream characters are conscious. I think there's 3 different studies in the literature. I'll have to look again. But basically what they inferred is that these dream characters have some sort of intelligence to them, like they can do certain tasks. And dream therapists actually recommend that you treat them as if they're conscious. And so I guess my question is, do you think that dreams themselves can help us understand the nature of reality? Because if if our consciousness can produce these dream characters within our own minds, then is it possible that the larger mind, aka God, could actually produce us in the same way that we would produce dream characters? Meaning we are dream characters essentially. What do you think about that?
That's such a tough question. My wife and I, we've been puzzling over this. Like how could anything produce people? It just seems weird. Like when I think of a self, and then I imagine like what might produce a self. I mean, can I produce a self? I see what you're saying. Like, well, maybe in a dream, you're literally producing other selves or something, and then you're interacting with them.
Right.
I don't know. That's hard for me to get my mind around, to be honest. So, I mean, to be honest, like I've even had the thought that it's impossible to produce people. But then here we are, right? I mean, so it's kind of like, how could there be anything, right? I mean,
I know
the best that I've come to is just to finish this thought is that it seems like there's just people producing powers. And I'm not sure how to explain that. Maybe they're just basic, and I'm not sure who has those powers. If we have them, maybe if we interact with other people in the right way, we produce other people. Or only if a foundational person has those powers. But that's a really puzzling question for me. And I
had a few thoughts myself. So I have a friend that we actually talk about this a lot. And what his idea is what's called subsumption. So when we sleep, we basically subsume into the dream, and then somehow our own consciousness will kind of fracture into these other conscious selves, and then those other conscious selves are basically dream characters. And so his idea, or our idea, I should say, is that that's kind of how God created us in a way, where God is the universal mind. Like we are in God's dream, and then we are just dream characters because we're kind of like fractured from God's consciousness. So that's I would say that's one way that you could actually explain how persons can be created. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Do these conscious selves in your dreams go away when you stop dreaming? Do they cease? Are they annihilated?
It depends. So some dream characters could continue on, but most of the time, they do
it seems sad. It seems like they should continue. I mean, I've had a dream. I remember having a dream. I was with my wife, and I realized I was dreaming, and then I was like telling her, "It was like, Rachel, you're not real. You're just a figment of my imagination." It's like you kind of, when you're dreaming, you know that feeling where you kind of know you're dreaming, but it kind of feels real. So it's like I really thought I was telling her, "You're not real."
Yeah.
I mean, if that was a real self, and then it ceases as soon as I wake up, I don't know, Kyle. That doesn't sound good to me.
I know. I just want to get your thoughts, but that's kind of my.
I can see how it's kind of a model for understanding how a self could kind of split into other selves, you know, as a theoretical possibility. It's interesting. Okay.
So now the next question has to do with God, and this has to do. I know you've written a book called "How Reason Can Lead to God," and you argue that God is perfection. So this question is, if God is perfect, then why can't we detect him scientifically? And I guess this might go back to the problem of hiddenness, but do you think that it's possible that we could, through the tools of science, discover the foundation for reality, and then like discover that, oh, this foundation is perfect? Or what do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of science broadly enough, so that you can make observations with all your senses, and then you can ask, well, what's the best hypothesis that explains all your observations? You know, you mentioned this kind of perfection at the root of reality. But there's also this other power that you have, which is this power of reasoning. And reasoning isn't just like a purely empirical sense. I mean, it's not even an empirical sense
Right.
at all, right? It's not seeing with your eyes or hearing with your ears. It's something you do sort of in your mind. And I actually wanted to mention that I actually think that the problem of consciousness, you can only see that it's a problem through reasoning. It's not an empirical problem. This is one of Chalmers' points, is that it's through reasoning that you can see that we can't just like turn this object. There's nothing we can do to turn this into the number 14. And you see that through reasoning, right? Just like you can see that you can't put a square and a circle together and have a square circle that's one shape, right? It's both square and circle. And so that opens the door to using that same power to investigate the foundation of things, you know? And so, I mean, in the book there, I make the argument through reason that differences between one shape and another are not relevant to this need for a further cause or explanation. And if that's right, then the foundation of reality, if there's a foundation or an ultimate cause, can't just be a shape, or can't have a fundamental shape, because shapes call for further explanation.
Right.
And so this leads us along a path. So I think, yeah, it opens up. But if we're limited to a kind of narrow view of science, then I think we're going to limit ourselves so much that we can't even know that 2 + 2 = 4, or that we're conscious.
Right, because I mean, if you think about it, science can't infer that somebody else is conscious through empiricism, right? So you have to, there has to be some sort of inference from reason.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even if it's a probabilistic inference, that probabilistic inference is based on the kind of awareness of probability relations in your mind.
Right.
Yeah, I don't see any way to justify the foundations of probability purely through seeing with your eyeballs or hearing with your ears, or any of those 5 senses. Yeah, so I think you do need these other powers.
Okay. And then also, you talk about what's this thing called value, right? And I had this is somewhat, I guess, relevant. So you talk about value in terms of meaning. And so do you think that meaning can exist without perfection? So is it possible to have some sort of like value or meaning without this perfection at the foundation?
Yeah, what do you mean by meaning there?
That's a good question. I didn't think about that one.
Well, I mean, because there's the meaning of a sentence, which you
right.
might think is a proposition or a thought or something like this.
I guess probably more broadly just the meaning of life.
Yeah, like a sense of purpose.
Right.
Yeah, you know, and I think you're getting at the primacy of consciousness. You know, it's like without consciousness, it seems like there wouldn't be meaning in any significant sense. There wouldn't be purpose, right?
Right.
And so, you know, I think underneath here is a question about whether you could have value, real value, without consciousness, without mind. And you might think you can't, because in order for there to be value, there has to be a mind. And then if you can't derive value from non-value, well, that would be another reason to think that the foundational reality has value. And if you can't have value without a mind, then that would be another reason to think the foundation of reality has a mind. I think this is your point here. Yeah.
No, yeah. It is my point, actually. So this actually goes back to the next question. So this distinction that we like to make between what's called the natural and the supernatural. Now, I know in your work, and I've read some of your dialogue with Felipe Leon about this, and you basically argue that God isn't really supernatural in the sense of being out beyond nature or beyond what we can know, that God actually is natural. So would you argue that we should talk about God more in terms of like some supreme foundation. Now, supreme just basically means unlimited value rather than simply something that's supernatural. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, the terms natural and supernatural are hard for me. And I'm actually part of a naturalist Facebook group. And it seems like the definitions of natural, even in that group, go across a spectrum. And then I've noticed like people who are outside of that group, they even have definitions of natural that go beyond what's included in that group.
Right.
And so I don't know, this is maybe part of my own kind of method in philosophy and in truth seeking, is try to get as clear as I can be on the basic terms. And I find that oftentimes people use terms that are kind of all over the map. And so I find it less helpful to use those terms. So I would rather not say that a foundational mind is supernatural. I'm actually happy to say that it is natural, if by that you mean that you can investigate it scientifically, as long as science is understood broadly enough to include what you can theorize with all your senses. And it's not a sort of a fundamentally different category than anything else. I mean, especially on the idealist frame, right? Where basically everything is either a mind or a state of mind, right? Like this right here is either a state of my own mind, my experience of it, or it's a state of the fundamental mind, the information that causes me to have that experience. And so everything would be sort of uniform in that way. So if I'm natural, then fundamental reality is natural. Why not?
Right. And this goes to the next question, which is, what do you think are some overlaps between naturalism and theism? So like, what do you think is like the best way to like bridge the two positions? Because typically what you see in at least the ones that are not in academia or like popular level apologists, you'll have this whole big battle over supernaturalism and supernaturalism, right? So there's never really it's hard to get a middle ground, because it's either you're a naturalist where you accept the one causal reality, which is, this world. But then if you're a theist, you have to accept, oh, well, there's something, this world plus there's something beyond this physical world that we experience.
Yeah.
But it seems like, especially for the idealists like myself, I don't see it like that. I think everything is pretty much all one causal reality, one substance. And then God is the foundation for that. So what do you think about the overlaps between those positions?
Yeah, I think it's really important to see what overlap there might be, because it brings clarity, it leads to productive conversation. So in my book with Felipe Leon, you mentioned this, he articulates a kind of naturalistic position. He calls it liberal naturalism. It's liberal because it will account for some of these other things like abstract objects, principles of reason, irreducible consciousness. He even talks about a teleological arrow, a kind of intentionality or natural intentionality at the foundation of reality, as a kind of hypothesis. He's putting that forward. And I was thinking, yeah, like I accept your basic ontology, and why add complexity to it? I am totally with that. And so, in fact, what I would want to say is that if you simplify the root of the fundamental reality, you can sort of shave off arbitrary limits, arbitrary complexities, arbitrary parameters in your theory of that foundation. You just simplify the root and you have a simple description. The foundation of reality is fundamentally perfect or supreme.
Right. And notice how so like okay, I'll get I'll talk about that in the next question, because I have a few thoughts on that. But I would agree with you overall that I guess the only real distinction between the two positions is under theism, you have fundamental reality as perfection, meaning it has no limit in its value. Again, we're just talking about the foundation. And then under naturalism, under any non-theist position, the fundamental nature of reality, it could be conscious, it could have some intentionality, but it doesn't really have infinite value, right? So it seems like just by that theism is simpler because it doesn't have arbitrary limits, right?
The theistic hypothesis wouldn't posit arbitrary limits. Now, I have thought that maybe you can get kind of equal simplicity if you just say that on one view, fundamental reality is perfect, and then on the other view, it's less than perfect. And we won't specify what limits are built in. We just leave that open. And maybe those are sort of on par in terms of their simplicity, but you don't get very much predictive power from just saying that reality is fundamentally less than perfect. You don't predict the principles of reason. You don't predict person building powers. You don't predict consciousness. Whereas if you just change the hypothesis to not that it's limited in some way, but it's just perfect, then you get so much predictive power. Because from perfection, you predict the person building resources, person building powers, principles of reason, and all sorts of other things that I think we have independent reason to think is true. So it's predictive power and predictive success matches with those things.
So I guess what predictions of the world are generated by that sort of which is theism?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it looks to me, okay, and I mean, I should display some humility and some caution. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, and my views have changed quite a bit as I've thought about these things. And so I don't want to suggest that this is sort of easy, or I don't want to come across triumphal here, because reasonable people can certainly disagree. But when I think about it, it seems to me that my understanding of a kind of perfect foundation as something that is supreme in value. You could think of it as something than which no greater could be conceived, this sort of Anselmian idea. It's sort of maximal in its value. It seems like that's going to predict that it will have valuable properties like the power to produce people, the power to think, the power to reason well, to a kind of moral perfection. And then this will predict, if there's a moral perfection, principles of morality,
right?
And the powers to produce moral agents, right? In fact, it has so much predictive power that I think the biggest objection to theism is that it's too predictive, that it predicts that the world would be better than it is, right? So you have the problem of evil, and I think that's probably the most important concern or worry that one can have against the theistic hypothesis, is that it actually predicts too much. But I think this also shows that it is a very predictively powerful hypothesis, and it gets so many things right that we can independently confirm.
Now, what's your thoughts? So there's one objection that I've heard, and I've also seen this on a few philosophical papers, but the objection is God could have created the world in a different way. So basically, since there's like an infinite amount of ways that God could have created the world, then theism wouldn't have predictive power, because God can just go in any direction he wants, right? What do you think about that?
It maybe doesn't predict everything that we see, right? Like maybe I can't tease out from God's perfection that these things exist right here and now. At least not with the kind of knowledge that I have. I mean, maybe there's a way. I've actually wondered about this. Like, it's like maybe if I really had all a priori knowledge, I could sort of see that the whole mathematical landscape and why that's necessary for rational thought, and then why making a world that leads to this specific experience is like part of the greatest possible story, the unfolding of the best characters, and you could just see all this a priori. So maybe in principle you could predict all that, but you don't have to predict everything to predict something. So it doesn't have to be so predictive that you can just see every single event from the hypothesis for there to be predictive success.
Right, and this does go back to one thing that I've been thinking about. So if you notice on naturalism, and when I mean by naturalism, it's just any view that accepts that the reality or the foundation for reality is imperfect, right? Mm-hmm. What I've noticed is, naturalists do have explanations for why morality exists, right? They have explanations for why there's contingent reality, right? Yeah. They have explanations for why there's reason, right? They have explanations. So like Graham Oppy, he'll say that the reason why mathematics is applicable to our universe is because it's just necessary. Or the reason that, fine tuning is the way it is because it's necessary, right? But notice, I've noticed this too. I don't know if you have, but all those things are like what's called unexplained necessary truths, meaning they don't have some simple foundation that can explain all of them. So they don't go back to something simple, but rather they're kind of just there, right? So they all have like different roots. They're not united under one root, but rather they're just kind of their different roots, right? And I
Yeah,
feel
you're
like,
adding to your theory.
and I
Is
feel
like
like
what you're doing. Yeah.
I feel like that is not a simple hypothesis, right? Because you have just kind of these necessary truths that are just there without this something perfect to ground them all in, right?
Yeah. I
What do
like
you
how
think
you
about
put
that?
that. Yeah, no, you put that really well. I've thought about that even in terms of explaining my own experiences. So, like right now, I could have an explanation that um, there's no Kyle Allen, or it kind of solves this, and like there's nobody else but me. Let's say,
Yeah.
in fact, all my experiences came into being, let's say, just from nothing. And then somebody asks, well, how? What explains that? I say, well, it was necessary that they came into being from nothing at this time. And that's what explains it. So I have an explanation. It's not brute. It's explained by its necessity, right?
Right.
But the worry there is that it's an overly complex explanation because I'm actually building the complexity of the thing to be explained into the explanation. I'm basically saying like all these experiences, that's the thing to be explained. That's all very complex. And then I'm building that into this explanation, which just says that they're necessary. So it's like I'm multiplying I mean,
Right. And it's not
I'm
just
not,
for,
yeah, it's like I'm multiplying, I almost want to say necessities without beyond necessity. But I mean, if they're necessities, then you want to say they're necessary. The problem isn't that. It's not even that they're brute because they're explained by their necessity. It's just that you have more complexity in your explanation than is required in the ultimate case, right? So if you can have an ultimate explanation that simplifies the root, that does seem to be intrinsically more probable.
no, right. And like you mentioned this in your, I know you, well, you use this example in your book, right? So let's say I walk outside and I see everything wet. Well, there's two hypotheses. Either one, it rained, right? So all the water came from one source, which is the clouds in this case. Or you can say that there's sprinklers that went off, that there was someone that made the street wet or the sidewalk wet, and then a bunch of birds just started spitting, water in the trees, right?
That's it.
So if just from there we can tell, okay, well, obviously the rain hypothesis is simpler because it's all coming from one source, right? And when you compare naturalism to theism, it's kind of the same thing where you have things like morality, you have things like value, reason, mathematics, fine tuning, all that stuff. But then notice how naturalism has to kind of have like different sources to ground those different things in, right? So you have to have a different explanation for why matter exists, or you have to have a different explanation for why, reason exists, or mathematics, or, morality. And it's just kind of there. But then you have theism, which explains all of this with just one source.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I love how you put that. And that's if we're talking about naturalism that competes with theism. But if instead we have the kind of liberal naturalism that we were talking about a moment ago,
right,
then the theism actually predicts. It's kind of like this kind of liberal naturalism has a lot of different sources of a lot of different things. And then theism unifies all those sources in terms of something more singular. So it gives you that deeper explanation of everything else. It's sort of the seed that leads out to all the branches.
Right. So yeah, I guess with related to that, I was wondering if you've ever read the philosopher Gregory Dawes, because he's written a book. It's called Theism and Explanation. Are you familiar with his work? Or
only about the sort of methodological naturalism? But that's about as far as I'm familiar with that. What are your thoughts about his work?
Well, I think he does bring a pretty interesting perspective, though. I probably like he brings up that informativeness, and I don't think theism has to be like this scientific project, right? So I think theism is just good at like explaining general facts, right? Theism doesn't have to explain specific facts, like again, like you mentioned earlier, it doesn't have to explain every single experience that I'm having, right? It just has to explain kind of general facts. So why morality exists, why reason exists, and all that stuff. So say that's kind of my
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that. But it does maybe provide a way of unifying the naturalist and the theist then, because you're not positing God to explain particular, one-off events, Rather, theism is just unifying your picture of the world. It's a picture you already have, and it's just giving you a seed or a root of that picture.
And I've been thinking, and I posted this I think about a week ago, that I like to make a distinction between non-foundational explanations and then foundational explanations. So like non-foundational explanations are like scientific explanations for things, right? Like that gives you a lot of informative value to something. But then foundational explanations are more like, okay, why is there science in the first place? Or those sort of general facts about the world that we all accept, right? So why do those things exist?
That's a helpful way of putting that. Yeah.
Right. So I guess the final question has to do with the problem of evil, because you did mention before that that's probably the most important obstacle. Like, I can understand like people that, again, you think that the foundation for reality is perfection, and I can understand why some people would object to that, saying, "Oh, well, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world?" Right. So I guess my question is, do you think that theodicy to evil actually explain things? So is there any like predictive power to like a certain theodicy that you give?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, in the book, I do talk about a kind of adventure or a story. I don't mean to suggest that evils are allowed for the sake of a story, like you're being used to make a play for God or something like that. Right. But rather that in the context of an adventure, in the context of a life, your soul experiences certain things. It experiences certain kinds of relationships, certain kinds of acts of heroism or compassion. And this results in a kind of development of souls in the context of this larger grand narrative of reality. This isn't an answer to the problem of evil, but it's a way of maybe framing or putting into context how even on theism, you might actually predict some problems. Problems are sort of the context for purpose. You know, I mean, if I've noticed that, like, if I get bored, I want to go play video games. What's a video game? It's artificial problems. You know, it's like we make problems for ourselves in order to ignite that sense of purpose, a sense of adventure. There's a tension. And again, this isn't to explain all evil or all suffering. It's just to say that if you're thinking of theism as explaining some kind of like broad features of the world, I actually think that the existence of vulnerability or the possibility, risk, the possibility of loss, all of those things actually seem, I think, quite plausible on a theistic worldview. So I think the problem of evil, it has to be worked out. It can't be you just point to some evil and say, therefore that's evidence against God. I mean, I actually make the argument that the sort of broad existence of evil, the broad existence of risk, seems to me to be what I would expect on theism. Whereas on non-theism, if I just say ultimate reality is arbitrarily limited, that's my hypothesis, that doesn't predict that there are going to even be shapes,
right?
Or let alone consciousness, let alone experiences, let alone evil. That doesn't predict any of that. It doesn't make any of that probable as far as I can see at all. So I'm not saying you can't fill in the hypothesis to predict the evil, but it's just once you fill in more and more and more, you diminish the prior probability of that hypothesis. And so that's why I would say that the existence of evil and suffering isn't sort of in itself obviously evidence against theism rather than even for theism. Which isn't to say that there aren't hard cases or that there isn't evidence against theism.
Right. Because from my perspective, my issue isn't that the problem of evil, I mean, yes, you could call it evidence against theism, right? But the question is, okay, does theism have the explanatory resources to actually explain this? So that's what we need to ask is, can theism explain why there is this thing we call evil? And not just, moral evil, but also natural evil and all that other stuff. And I do think that I think theism does have explanatory resources to explain evil, just as it has, explanatory resources to explain everything else that we experience. So that's my perspective.
But, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So we've actually, oh wow, we got just on time, about the hour
Perfect.
mark. I know there was, you want to take questions from the audience real quick,
That
or
would
do
be
you want to?
fine. And I mean, I don't know why, but I feel like I'm just like itching to somehow share this counting argument that I have. Maybe
If you want to
it's,
share it, you
yeah. I
can.
mean, maybe I could just show it on the screen. This is an argument for not reducing everything about persons to material states. And so let me just get that onto the screen here. I'm going to share. Okay. And we're going to do an application. And we're going to do the counting arguments. And we're going to delete all my other notes. I think this will just be interesting. Can you see this screen here? Is it showing up?
I could see it. Yeah. So
Yeah, good. This is an additional reason for thinking that there's more to your mind than just material configurations or even functions of material configurations. And I want to just share this argument. It's a mathematical argument that I think can kind of push the conversation forward. So the first premise there is that there are more conceptual configurations. A conceptual configuration would be if you kind of put some concepts together in your mind. So like you have a concept of a bear and a concept of a unicorn, and then you could have the concept of a bear or a unicorn. And that sort of disjunction, the or there, creates a kind of conceptual configuration in your mind. The first premise is that there are more conceptual configurations than material configurations of like shapes and particles in the world. Why I think that? Well, here's the argument. For any material configurations, there's a visual representation of it, or at least a possible or conceivable visual representation of it. The whole argument is in terms of possible conceptual configurations. They don't even have to be actual. So the idea here is that for any material configuration, you can imagine some possible mind that represents that. It sees that landscape and creates a mental image of it in their mind. In fact, your argument, Kyle, would be that, well, this is already the case, because this sort of the idealism would imply that all material configurations really just are mental configurations already.
right.
But this first premise is just that it's at least possible for there to be a visual representation of it. Next premise is that for any set of visual representations, there's a conceptual configuration about those representations. Here's why. It's because you can take all those individual visual images, like an image of a bunny and an image of a unicorn, and then you can think about them all together. You could think that they're all silly, for example. That's a silly image of a bunny. That's a silly image of a unicorn. Or you could think of them disjunctively. I think that's silly or that's silly. So there's many ways of combining them. The next premise is that there are more sets of visual configurations than visual configurations. And you can prove that by Cantor's theorem, which I won't get into. But the idea is that for any collection of things, there's more sets of members of that collection than individual members. So there's going to, if you take the collection of all the visual configurations, there's going to be more sets of visual configurations than individual visual configurations. And from all those premises, it follows that there are more conceptual configurations than material configurations, because there's at least as many conceptual configurations as sets of visual configurations. That was premise 1b. And by Cantor's theorem, then there are more conceptual configurations than material configurations. And so therefore, not every conceptual configuration is material. By uniformity, you might think that the conceptual configurations are sort of all of one category. So if some of them aren't material, none of them are material. Or if some of them are material, they're all material. Now, one could play around with that premise, but if that premise is true, then all conceptual configurations aren't material. And even if that uniformity premise isn't true, there's still a kind of disjunctive property of having a conceptual configuration. And it looks like that's not going to be material if even some conceptual configurations aren't material. And so that would be enough to show that you have at least some properties that aren't material. And so there you go. That's another argument against reduction. And I have some published papers on this where I develop it in more detail. But I think it's helpful to see that there are other arguments beyond the kind of classic arguments that people might be familiar with.
Right. And yeah, it is, I guess, helpful to make those sort of points. So, all right. And then, okay, so I had one question. Do you hold the divine simplicity?
Well, no, what do you mean by that?
Just, okay, because people have different views on that.
Yes.
So you have the Augustine view, which is basically that God is simple, like in the absolute sense. So you can't actually describe like different attributes. So it's all just one attribute. So would you say, okay, what I mean by simplicity is, does God, I guess, only have one attribute? Like,
so I don't think he does. When I was at Notre Dame, I got into these conversations with people about this question, and some people would tell me that all God's attributes are one. So his knowledge and his power really in God are one. We conceptually distinguish his knowledge and his power, but these are conceptual distinctions that don't match real distinctions in God. And I remember there was a lake around Notre Dame, and I would walk around that lake and I would ponder that. I would think, how could that be true? And Kyle, I could never get myself to think that was true. It just seemed like, no, these are really distinct. If they're conceptually distinct, then these concepts are revealing real differences.
No, right.
Okay? But I've actually had a transformation in my thinking, even in the course of writing my book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And this happened as I began to see the power of perfection to predict the other attributes and to explain them. And I began thinking, like, all these positive attributes, knowledge, power, goodness, why does God happen to have all the positive ones? Why does the foundation of reality happen to be positive in all those respects? Seems like there's got to be a deeper explanation. And this led me to think that God has a more fundamental attribute that is itself simple. So then I started thinking, well, now I'm getting really close to divine simplicity, because I can now say that there's one single simple foundational attribute of God that grounds God's other attributes. And then the remaining question for me is God identical to his attribute? And so now I take these walks and I think about that question, right? In the end, where I'm at right now is that God grounds his fundamental attribute. It's not that he's identical to it.
Okay, that makes
or
sense.
If he is identical to it, then it's kind of a verbal debate here.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally, it's the same thing. Like God and perfection are so unified. God just grounds that. So that would be my view. And so that gives me a very simple account of ultimate reality. But I think what's relevant to getting an explanatory advantage is not even the simplicity of the being so much as the simplicity of the theory. But I have a simple being then fundamentally and a simple theory, which I think is cool. I guess that's
because some people ask me, like, do I hold this mind simplicity? I'm like, in some ways, yes. Like, I do think that ultimately all of his attributes that we normally talk about, like his omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, like all those attributes there's a deeper explanation of those attributes, and that would be perfection, right? But I still have like this conceptual distinction I can still make, right? So, I guess you could call it like some sort of modified divine simplicity, where you could still make distinctions, right? But they're all still, God ultimately only has one attribute, or at least this one attribute is kind of like the ground for all the other attributes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's it. And in fact, there might be this might provide a kind of unity between different camps of people thinking about this. It might provide a way of translating, because sometimes I hear my Thomist friends talk about God's grounding these conceptual distinctions, and then I'm thinking, man, that seems very close to the view that I've come to. I mean, I want to say that God's knowledge is a real property of him that God has, and it's not the same as God's goodness, but there's a deeper ground of those properties that's one and simple, it seems to me. Yeah.
All right. And then let's see. We're just going to go through a few questions and then we'll kind of close off.
Good.
But the first one is what his thoughts are on Thomistic holomorphism.
that when I was in graduate school, I sort of arrived at a view that is very similar to that. And but there are some distinctions to be made. I mean, the idea that I came to is that human beings are, in some sense, prior to their parts, and there's a way of articulating that in terms of form and matter as a kind of unity. I've found some formulations of that to be kind of esoteric and hard to understand, but that doesn't mean that they're not understandable. It just means I personally found them hard to understand without translating them into contemporary terminology, philosophical terminology. And when I did that, it seemed like the view that I arrived at was maybe in the spirit of it, I would say.
Okay. All right. And the next question, you asked us about specificity. Oh, okay. So I think this has to do with people's, I guess, different conceptions of what perfection actually is. So I guess what's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's two things here. There's the specificity problem, which you might think sort of diminishes the intrinsic probability. Because, if I tell you that the foundation of reality has the power to produce 35 electrons and no more, that's a very specific number. Why that number?
Right.
And so that would kind of diminish the probability. And you might think there's a kind of similar worry here if you think of God having these specific perfections, all knowledge, all goodness. Why those perfections? I mean, I think that's where having a kind of non-arbitrary root of the perfections, a kind of simple perfection that predicts those perfections, can help you with that. So you don't have the kind of arbitrariness problem. And in that case, I don't really think that the prior probability or the intrinsic probability is diminished if you have a kind of simple, conceptually simple explanation of the other properties. Now, as far as the subjectivity of perfection, that's difficult. That is very difficult, because if there is a kind of current of thinking that all statements of value are subjective. I mean, we're even taught this in school.
Right.
In my kids, they got a worksheet, fact versus opinion. And on the opinion side were statements of value. They were all opinion. And, these were the facts about opinions, right? A fact is something that can be proven. But of course, they never proved that value statements are just opinions.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I actually take some time in my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, to first remove barriers to the objectivity of value. So I consider reasons that people think value might be purely and only subjective. And then also motivating a distinction between subjective value based on preference and a more objective value that I think you can sort of recognize when, by example, like it's objectively valuable to be rational versus irrational, or to get to truth versus to not have truth. So I do think that there's a way of supporting objective value through example. And I think there is something kind of intuitive, even when you sort of think about attributing value to somebody or to something. I sometimes use this example of a praise test. If I'm praising somebody, I say, I'll look to my wife, Rachel, and I say, Rachel, you're just so awesome. You're so magnificent. You're so valuable. You're so weak. You can't do anything right. No, that last thing that I said is not like the others. And I think we have this kind of intuitive grasp that is not like the others, a kind of basic grasp of that. And so that's some of the things I would say about that. It's a good question. It's not an easy question to answer. There's a lot more that could be said there, but I think that more can be said.
All right. So I think, we've reached our time. But anyways, thank you for coming on. It was really a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. This is fun.
Yeah. And I hope that we can continue, because my current series I'm working on is actually based on your work. So, people are going to still be knowing about your work.
I've been watching that. That's amazing. I'm very excited about what you're doing. Good work on that.
So I just want to thank you, Josh, for coming on. Thank you for the audience for asking those questions and getting some sort of clarification. But so just one last question. Are you going to be working on anything new, like any books you're writing or anything like that?
My next project is going to be on the nature of persons. And so I've begun to work on the outline for that. And yeah, that's my current project, persons and consciousness, and what it is and how it could exist. So kind of what we were talking about today.
All right. Well, thanks, Josh, for coming on. I'm going to end the broadcast. So,
cool. Thank you.
Yep. Have a nice day.